After creating such masterpieces like La Strada, La Dolce Vita, and 8½, Federico Fellini decided to tell a much more intimate and personal story. Borrowing many aspects from his own life, the resulting film became a beautiful tableau of small-town whimsy and imagination. Hello, I'm Peter Garrett, and this is the Criterion Chronicle. Welcome to the Criterion Chronicle. I'm your host, Peter Garrett. The Criterion Chronicle is the chronological journey through the Criterion Collection, starting from DVD Spine number 1. Now, the next stop on our journey takes us to Criterion Spine number 4, Federico Fellini's fantastical ode to his small-town upbringing, AMARCORD. Now, AMARCORD focuses on the lives of the people of a small coastal town in Italy named Borgo San Giuliano, with the primary focus on a teenager named Tita and his family and friends. Now, granted, instead of having a traditional linear narrative, the film is a series of standalone episodes meant to show different aspects of the life, in this town at that time and place, which is roughly in the 1930s. It doesn't specify exactly, but it's basically when Fellini was a teenager. So, like 15 years old, 16 years old. So AMARCORD was released in 1973 as Fellini was pretty much entering the latter stage of his career. So, often when directors get to this point, their work begins to start to shift in tone, which in Fellini's case was more sentimental and nostalgic. So, for instance, Akira Kurosawa, his last films in the 90s, Dreams, Rhapsody in August, and Madedeo, were much more personal and intimate reflections on life than, say, his previous large period films and action films and samurai films. So, and then Clint Eastwood, he started to make more introspective films later in his career, like Unforgiven, Letters from Iwo Jima, and Gran Torino. And then finally, Tarantino's last film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, basically served as a love letter to the Hollywood that he grew up with and that existed in his youth. So directors oftentimes, when they get to that point in their career, they start to look back on their past life, the way they grew up, and they look at it from a way of with this, of course, with this rose-colored glasses that we often see. But there is a fine line a director must walk when entering into this period of the career so that they don't slip into over sentimentality or basically, schmaltz. So, but it was at this point in Fellini's career he had firmly established himself as one of the greatest film directors in the world. Having made these classics like La Strada, La Dolce Vita, and 8½. So by this point, he could choose to shift his focus to something that was, to more lighthearted stories and things that were a little more personal in that way. So, but granted, Fellini always had a sense of wonder in his films. So unlike, say, Roberto Rossellini, who's considered the godfather of Italian neorealism, and whose films reflected a much more grounded and sometimes bleak look at the world. But, Fellini's films, especially his later ones, were so much more visually vibrant, with an almost hyper-reality or fairy tale-like quality to them. What's really interesting to me, and this was a crazy stat when I found this out, was, because I didn't realize this, was AMARCORD was Fellini's 4th film to win an Oscar for Best Foreign Film, which actually is a record for competitive wins in that category. So I had no idea he had won that many. We look at the Oscars and we think, one director winning in that category, which is now called Best International Feature, not Best Foreign Film. But, I feel like it's rare especially now, for one filmmaker to have multiple wins in that category. But his 3 previous wins before AMARCORD were for La Strada, Knights of Cabiria, and 8.5. So now he did set it was a tie record though. So the only other director who also has 4 is another Italian director named Vittorio De Sica. So, but technically though, 2 of those wins he got before the category was officially created in, I think it was 1956. So, but what makes AMARCORD, so remarkable of a film is how Fellini is able to make something so joyous with fascism serving as this kind of background dominant force that was happening in Italy at the time. And, and I'll talk about this a lot later, but, it's difficult to imagine anybody making a film with fascism in it that is meant to be this, almost a comedy in a lot of ways. I mean, the film is very comedic in a lot of the, especially in the first half. So the second half gets a little more serious, but the first half definitely has a lot more comedy to it. And that includes some of the scenes with when fascists show up in the town. But again, it's a different time. The movie came out over 50 years ago. So, filmmaking has obviously gone through a lot of changes in regards to how certain things are portrayed anymore. In Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, that was a whole satire on fascism. So the whole movie's a giant joke on not just even fascism, but Nazism. So it'd be crazy to think of a movie being made like that today. So I think the choice to make the film a series of vignettes instead of one just main storyline makes it a much richer and more complete experience. Because again, you get all these different flavors from the characters and from the scenarios. So I just think that having that variety really makes this film feel a lot more enjoyable to watch. So, and there are other films that have been autobiographical in nature, but AMARCORD actually, so he made 2 other films that are considered probably his more, actually no. I don't want to spoil this. I feel like I'll mention this later on. But yeah, it's, even though it was his, he had made other autobiographical films, this one was considered his most personal film because it was tied to his youth. So again, in Federico Fellini's career, he would make and again, so this is why I was getting a little ahead of myself, unfortunately. So he made other films that were considered autobiographical. So the first one that he made was called I Vitelloni, which came out in 1953, which focuses on a group of friends in a small town, which and I think the characters in that movie are basically like, I think in their early 20s. So they're like 21, 22. So they're right like at the cusp of going out into the world and leaving the town, or, embarking on their lives. So, and I think that one was a lot more rooted in his town that he grew up in, Rimini in Italy. So, whereas, AMARCORD is different. And then the second film he made that was autobiographical, which is actually considered probably his most autobiographical film, is called 8.5, which came out in 1963. And that film is about a film director trying to navigate success within his life. So, and this came out basically right when Fellini was hitting his peak, arguably, as a director. So, and Marcello Mastroianni, who plays the lead in that film, he's basically navigating all this stuff, and he's the Fellini character cipher in the movie. So, but then the third one is AMARCORD. So, and when I looked at it, I thought it was interesting how each of these films was made 10 years apart. So it's almost like each one of these films came out at a different point in Fellini's career. So I Vidaloni came out in 1953 when he was still a little, was still young, a younger filmmaker. He had only had a couple of films, I think, at that point that he had directed by that point. So it was a much fresher film. And then 8.5 comes out 10 years later when he's hit his stride and he's in the middle of it. And then AMARCORD comes out in 1973, and now he's kind of getting into that latter part, not quite the twilight of his career yet. I'd say give him another maybe 10 years in the 80s when he's like in that final stretch, because I think he died in the 90s. But I think it's interesting how each one of those films kind of serves almost as an unofficial trilogy for him as a person. So if you were to watch all three of those films back to, it's one of those, movies we love to look at like unofficial trilogies. So I think that I Vidaloni, 8.5, and AMARCORD serve as the kind of unofficial Fellini autobiographical trilogy. But directors, making a film about their childhood and adolescence is very common, because inspiration comes easiest from our own lives, typically. So, for instance, there are examples would include Barry Levinson's Diner and Avalon, Giuseppe Tornatore's Cinema Paradiso, which is a beautiful film, Spike Lee's Crooklyn, Steven Spielberg's The Fabelmans, and a wealth of others that are out there. So, but what I thought was really fascinating was the fact that the town in AMARCORD was a fictional creation. So, as I said before, Fellini grew up in a town called Rimini, but Fellini chose not to set the film in Rimini. He chose to set it in a fictional location for a few reasons. And one of the reasons was he didn't want to risk the townspeople kind of seeing themselves in the film and potentially being made fun of. So he didn't want, because he loved these people. He didn't want to make fun of them. But he didn't want to risk offending them. And another reason he chose to make the film in a different place was because he felt like shooting in the actual town of Rimini was going to be just too difficult for him. So the town in the film, he thought that the film was going to just bring in too many emotions as he was directing it. So the town in the film is actually not it's not named in the movie. So I looked it up, and it said, when I looked it up, it said that it's called Borgo San Giuliano, but because that was the area, I guess that was the area around Rimini, where Rimini was and the seaside towns and everything like that. So, technically maybe that's not what the town is called, Borgo San Giuliano, but when I looked it up, that's what was referenced, and that's how it was referenced. But I'll mainly just refer to it as the town and stuff like that. So, but I think it's actually a very beautiful location, in my opinion. And because of that, many of the scenes have a dreamlike quality to them because of how idyllic it looks. So, and maybe that's because growing up in the United States, we don't have, at least not in the West Coast, we don't have a lot of towns that look like that. I mean, maybe you go to the East Coast and there's some small towns that date back to like the 1700s and the 1800s, and they might have a really beautiful old style look. But you go to Europe and they're just everywhere. You throw a rock and you hit a little town that looks like it could be a movie set. So, and that's what this town was. So I don't know exactly where the town was. I wasn't able to find out where it was shot exactly, but again, because of the beautiful look of the town, it just right from the very beginning, it looks like this it just looks like this amazing place. So, in the very beginning, when the puffballs are floating in the air, it gives the town this ethereal quality. So, as well as most of the scenes at the Grand Hotel are beautiful looking. The flashback, including the flashback of when Gradiska got her name, when the emir comes with his harem and they come to stay at the hotel, there's this fantasy sequence with them. So, and it makes it just look, it just makes it look like, that scene where they're all dancing and everything like that, I'm sure that was a set. I'm sure all the interiors for the hotel were a set. But then you have the nighttime dancing sequences on the hotel terrace when the fog is covering the town and the boys are dancing outside. And then probably my favorite scene in the film is when the whole town goes out to sea to watch an ocean liner, the SS Rex, pass by. As well as, there's a race sequence that's at dawn. There's so many moments in the film that just are so beautiful looking. And that's something that I really think, again, makes the film stand out in a lot of ways. So now, and it's funny because in the previous episode, for the one I did for The Lady Vanishes, I talked about how a film that is shot on one location creates a sense of character for the setting. But for AMARCORD, it does that in a different way. So while the town itself is the main setting of the film, we get a much greater array of different places in and around the town, giving us more of a sense of geography. So there's the main square where many scenes take place. There's, like the opening scene with the bonfire, when the fascists come into town, in winter when it snows and they have a snowball fight. There's also, this is probably my favorite location in the film, is the pier that we see where the character Volpina is walking along and a motorcyclist goes on it at one point, and then also at the very end when Tita is walking there. That's a great location. I wish they had used it more in the film, but it's still, I think that's probably my favorite location in the film. The Grand Hotel, which becomes this bustling hub of activity during the summer. So because we see this, we begin to feel like we're residents of this small coastal town as well by the end of the film. So it feels so alive as a location, primarily because the way the characters interact with it. So in the beginning, there's this bonfire scene that basically it sets the tone of the sense, the community that the town has and how the characters interact with each other. Because we see them all gathering, we see how they have fun, how they play pranks on each other. Like there's a point where there's a man who's building the bonfire in the middle, and then somebody basically comes over and steals the ladder away so the guy can't get down again. So he's like, "Hey man, what are you?" And he's got to figure this out. So it really sets the tone for everything because the whole town is there. So another great scene is when Tita and his friends are cruising around at night, basically seeing if anything is going on. And they're following Gradiska. They're going around just kind of, again, because back then they had, kids had no technology. They had no video games. They had no TV. They had nothing. All they could really do was just go out and just do stuff. So that's pretty much, what they did. And then when all the townspeople are going to sea, so they can see the SS Rex, we also get to see them all interacting with each other when they're on the boats. So just so many great character interactions in the film. And I think that's why I think the vignette work so well, is because it's more about that. What I think is cool is the film has a primary narrator. So who's basically, he's called like the lawyer. He's referred to as the lawyer, but he's this kind of happy man, and but he pretty much serves as the voice of the town. Yeah, and he's a part of it. So because he's a resident as well, so he pops up numerous times throughout the film to serve as our guide. So, but what's really interesting is how he'll have a moment where he'll talk to us, and then he'll talk to somebody else off screen. So it's like he's interacting in both spaces. He's interacting with us as the audience, and then the other characters in the film. So, but the thing that I think though, really, but again, just overall, that makes this town just feel bigger than it are the characters, because the characters are so larger than life in a way. Their personalities and their look, they're very, very, very vibrant. So the most prominent character is Gradiska, who she's this, she works at a hair salon, or a beauty, like some sort of, she does hair. She's basically like a hairstylist beautician. But she's pretty much the largest figure in the whole film in regards to her aura, as it were, her stature in this town. Everybody knows her. Everybody, there's like, she is just this central figure in this town. But I think it's because, she carries herself like she's much bigger and more impressive than where she is. It seems like she needs to be in a city like Milan or Rome or Venice or something, or instead of this small town by the sea. And but the reverence though, that for Gradiska, it's almost like she's a muse to everybody. So she just she's the object of affection for most of the boys, as well as a lot of the men in the film. And then a lot of the film kind of hinges on her, like pretty much what's going on in her life in certain ways. So like after Tita, who is arguably the main character of the movie, Gradiska is probably the second lead after that point. So, so you have Gradiska, and then you have Tita's father, Aurelio, who is also this kind of big figure. He's this bombastic man who basically serves as this always put upon critic, and of Tita and everything, and everything he does, and everything and just everything around him. He's often exploding in these loud historical rants to his family. So often, obviously, again, played more for comedy, but we feel like he's based on a real guy. What I think is actually what's fascinating is the character of Tita was actually not based on Fellini himself, which I found really interesting. But I'm going to save that for a little later in the episode. So another character you have who is this just jumps off of the screen, and she's not even in it that much, is her name is Volpina, and she's never they never explicitly say like what she is. Like you get the feeling that she could be a prostitute, because she's got this high, very, very high sex drive and libido. And we just see her, in every scene that she's in, it's has something to do with sex, because this movie has a lot of sexual stuff, at least sexual innuendo, I should say, going on. But all of her scenes are meant to basically just be like she's this. I mean, maybe if she's not a prostitute, she's essentially like a nymphomaniac, pretty much. And then another character in the film that is she literally is just on the screen, and she's undeniable, is the tobacconist. So she's this large and curvy woman who just, every time you see her, she just dominates the frame. And again, she's not in the film very much. Same thing with Volpina, and she doesn't even have a name. She's just the tobacconist. But her presence, though, is so powerful that she leaves an impression. I think she's such a prominent figure. She's actually she's the biggest figure, I think, on one of the film posters. So, which just shows her prominence. But even the smaller characters in the film are memorable. So you have, Bashane, who he's this street vendor where he's got all these different stories that he tells that you don't know if he's telling the truth or not. You've got all of Tita's friends, essentially. Like that, and that's another thing. All the characters are very visually distinctive. Like they're really easy to pick out. And the same goes with Tita's friends. He's got all these different types of friends. He's got there's a really tall guy. You've got this, the blonde hair who's got a little bit of a mustache and wears a hat. You have the youngest one, the little guy, and then you've got a bigger guy. Who's so they're all really easy to pick out. So, but then you also have this, you have a blind accordion player, which I mentioned, and then you have this, you have a suave, during the dancing sequence at the hotel, there's this suave looking man with a streak of gray in his hair, and at one point he's dancing with this very glamorous looking woman at the hotel. And again, that's the only real scene that you see either one of them in, and you remember them. So, which I think it just makes the film, it just makes the town and the film pop off. So while Borgo San Giuliano serves as the beautiful foundation for the narrative, it's really the themes of the movie that make AMARCORD such a universal and beloved film. Now, while AMARCORD is about the town and its people, the main focus of the story is on the character of Tita, who, as I said, he's a teenager and his group of friends. So, and I think why the film has this strong energy to it is the fact that youth is at the center of the narrative. So most of the film's perspective comes from Tita, and primarily, and then by extension, his friend group. Although Tita really is the only one we follow regularly. It never splits off to give us another one of his friends' perspectives. It's Tita. We only see Tita's family. We only see Tita's, experiences when he is, out in the town doing stuff. I mean, actually, no. So there is one, I think it's, I forgot what his name was. I think it's like Ciccio. He's the bigger guy. We see a few like daydream sequences of his, but that's about it. Everything else is basically from Tita's point of view. And so again, as I said before, Tita was not based on Fellini. It was actually based on one of Fellini's close friends growing up, whose name was also Tita. And as well as like Tita's family was also based on this real guy's family. So, and I think because the film is about youth, it covers all the different facets of being an adolescent and growing up. So the film's, like, the first scene has the bonfire, but the first like character scene, where I think it's like the film's proper introduction to the boys, starts with them in school. So it starts with them taking a school photo, and then proceeds to show a montage of different classes they have in school. And the classroom scenes are presented in a way to make it seem like they're dull and boring, and that really the only way that these kids can get through sometimes is by doing pranks and other kind of hijinks in there. So for instance, there's one part where one of Tita's friends does a prank on another student that involves, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'll just say it involves a bodily function in it. Whereas, and then there's another sequence where the youngest member of the friend group, he's trying to, one of the teachers is trying to speak, teach him to say a word in Greek, and he keeps purposely messing it up, much to the teacher's, anger and annoyance. So, again, just to mess with him, because again, when you're a kid, and that's what you're going to do. So you have the start with the in school sequence, and then following that, there's an extended dinner scene that shows Tita with his family and how they react with each other. So you have Tita's father, Aurelio, who always seems to be upset about something. He's yelling at Tita about pretty much everything. You have Tita's mother, Miranda, who's basically just trying to maintain some semblance of order and peace in the house. So you have Tita's grandfather, who basically just keeps telling stories like an older person from his past. So, and he's a funny character, because he's just he's just kind of this happy-go-lucky old man, for the most part. And then you have like his uncle, who is looked at as kind of the freeloader of the family, who also his father also doesn't like, because he thinks, this guy's a grown man, but he's still acting like a child in a way. So, and then, so you've got the family scene, and then what I think is probably one of the funniest scenes in the film is when Tita goes to confession, because he goes there, and obviously it's meant to be, it should be theoretically, I guess, a more serious scene, because religion is I'm sure it was a big part of small town life, but Fellini has the scene play out in a much funnier way, where the priest pretty much is not really paying attention to Tita and anything he has to say, as well as Tita having his own internal monologue saying, well, this guy doesn't really care, so I'm not gonna tell him. I'm not gonna be honest with him, because I'm just gonna, why put that out there? So Tita just, says kind of has a minimal confession compared to what he might normally have given. And then the father is just like, all right, here's your absolution. Say this, say this, say this. So, and I think, well, the film, it doesn't condemn or criticize religion openly. I just think that it presents it as, as routine, and because it's coming from that place of adolescence, as just kind of like this inconvenience of everyday life, like it's a chore. So, because, it reflects the idea that a lot of kids and teens probably see going to church more just as like, okay, I'm doing this out of a sense of obligation because this is what my family wants me to do, instead of a strong personal choice like they might have when they get older. I think that the overall scene, though, is just funny because, again, it just makes it seem like this religious, that going to church is this, again, it's just not a really fun thing to do, and that they'd rather be doing something else. So, and I also thought, another funny thing is, so after Tita gives his confession, one of his friends comes over, and before the kid even sits down, the priest is like, nope, okay, you say this, you're done. Leave me alone. Like, he doesn't even want to hear this kid talk about what sins he has. So it's just a great moment. So, but, and even though the film takes place in the 30s, watching Tita try to navigate his home life and with his friends and his fantasies, it feels like it could still apply a lot to today. So, which is why I think the film has just this strong universal resonance to it. Everyone knows what it's like, being boarding class, or, having to deal with a crazy, crazy or eccentric family members. So the idea that, that we can see life in this town almost 100 years ago, and we can look at these characters and think, yeah, I totally acted the same way with my parents growing up, or in class doing, nodding off, or my mind just wandering and not really paying attention because there's just other things I'd rather do. So you have youth, but then one of the other major recurring themes in the film is sex. So, and as I said, it's not a sexual movie. There's not like sex scenes or anything in it, but sex just permeates in a lot of, again, in innuendo and in a lot of other ways. And Fellini often, he incorporated sex and sexuality into his films a lot, and pretty unapologetically. So, for instance, in Nights of Cabiria, it's about a prostitute with Giulietta Messina, and in some of his other films like Satyricon and Roma, there's a lot of sexual stuff in there. So, and I think, because the main character, pretty much is a teenage boy along with his friends, we're going based on that kind of teenage time in our lives when our hormones are raging and our libidos are just in constant overdrive. So because of that, we see them, throughout the film. They're constantly just being driven by these impulses, these sexual impulses that they have. So like when they're out and about in the town and they're following Gradiska and they're all just like they've got this kind of, swagger going when they're walking. And you can tell that they're like, kind of hot to trot. And the camera, lingers on, on certain parts of her body. And then there's, when Tita tells the story of supposedly when he followed, in the summer, when he followed Gradiska into a movie theater and it was just the two of them sitting there. And so they're watching a movie and Tita gradually gets closer, he switches seats to get closer and closer, to Gradiska until finally he's right next to her and he puts his hand on her leg and tries to get something going. But then Gradiska just kind of turns and looks at him and is like, "Can I help you with something?" And he's like, "Damn, that did not go the way that I thought." And then going back to the confession scene, one of Tita's classmates admits that he and a few other boys, as one of their sins, they all masturbated in a car together. So, which, is, I don't know many people that did that. Maybe in there, I don't know if that was actually based on a real experience that based on real life, because I personally have never heard of anybody doing that when they're teenagers. Everybody just getting into a car to do that. And then when the boys are in the marketplace and they're watching all the women in the marketplace just like getting on their bicycles, and it's just again all focused on their on these butts sitting on the bikes, and all the kids are just like staring and looking deeply at it. So again, just all this stuff. Even when there's even a part when they're looking at a statue that's got this pronounced derriere, and the reaction to it is just again like what a teenager would do. So the very kind of vulgar, I want to say, behavior. So, but again, it's meant to be played for comedy. But the funny thing is again, because one of the hallmarks of teenage sexuality is how it tends to be all drive and no skill. Going back to to the movie theater scene with Gradiska. And, again, he tries to make a move and she basically just is kind of, shuts that down. But then there's probably the most sexual scene, I guess, in the film is when Tita has a nighttime encounter with the voluptuous tobacconist. So, but it ends up being incredibly silly because the tobacconist demands that Tita please her, but he's too inexperienced and clumsy to do it correctly. So basically, it like he tries to, it starts with him saying, "Hey, I can pick you up," and then he picks her up, and then she's laughing and all this stuff, and when he puts her down, he's visibly, exhausted, but then she's basically all turned on by this, which follows and leads to what happens next, which I won't say exactly what happens. I will say you should watch the movie and see what he does, because it's pretty funny. But what I think is what I think is really interesting is how Tita is not interested in the girls of his own age in his class or in his school, but he's interested in the older, more developed women. So, which I think is also a hallmark of the kind of teenage boy experience, because this leads in later on, when we get to movies where you have the mature woman who is played as a sexual fantasy. So there's elements of that in this. So, and you can say that it serves as the precursor for that older, for that uninhibited older woman who's looking for a young lover. So think of like Stifler's mom in American Pie. But it's not just the teenagers that are focused on sex. So the character of Volpina, as I mentioned earlier, her whole character is basically that she's just on the prowl essentially the entire time in the film. So like there's a scene where Tita's talking about how one time I helped her, I was pumping up a bicycle tire, and and we're meant to, and it's supposed to be this most kind of innocent interaction. He's just pumping up a bicycle tire, and Volpina just has this look of like she's going to devour him as a result. So, and then you have Tita's grandfather, who he brings up sex repeatedly in his musings. So, which I think is one of the funniest things. So like when he's at the dinner table, or when they're on the outing at, when they're at the outing with Tita's uncle. So, and then there's at one point, we're in a group of prostitutes come into town, and it causes, quite a stir in it. And then during the Grand Hotel sequence with the concubines of the Emir and the Basheen character who's telling us that there were 30 women there that came there, he basically says that he basically had sex with almost all of them. So, and then there's a scene where they meet up with another one of Tita's uncles who has some behavioral issues, and they go out to a farm for an afternoon, and it ends with his uncle Tio stuck basically up in a tree, and he's constantly shouting, "I want a woman!" And he just keeps repeating it. "I want a woman! I want a woman!" So sex and sexuality is just all coursing through the film so much. So, and I feel like Fellini has always just been a lover of the female form and figure, because he enjoys highlighting, a woman's body and her curves so much. So, and he's done this in multiple films, but there's multiple shots in this film where it's mainly on butts. I think that maybe he was a butt guy primarily. I don't know, because he also featured women with very large breasts in his movies as well. So I don't know if he was both, but like, for instance, when Gradiska is introduced in the barbershop, she does this little dance, and she comes out of a curtain and basically butt first coming out. And again, the same thing with the boys watching the women on the bicycles during the snowball fight when Gradiska joins in. They all throw it, and there's a shot where we're seeing multiple snowballs hitting her rear end. So butts feature prominently in Fellini's films, but then also breasts do as well, because he has very women with very large breasts. The tobacconist having extremely large breasts, or huge boobs compared to everybody else in the film. Which those feature prominently in the scene I was talking about earlier with Tita. And unfortunately I can't show that scene here, but again, I recommend when you watch the film. And then during the Grand Hotel dancing sequence, the glamorous looking woman I mentioned who's dancing with the man, the suave looking man, she's got large breasts. So again, these are body parts that are meant to stand out. Like, they're not meant to be in the background. And again, we don't know her name. We don't know her relation. That's the only scene we see her in. But the only thing we remember about her really is the fact that she's got these large boobs. So, and even one of the teachers at the school has very pronounced breasts through her sweater when she's teaching a lesson. So, again, all of these factors play into the fact that this story has a lot of it's a very sexually charged story, but in a way it's almost still innocent, because again, it's not sexually explicit. And the only real sex scene in the movie is played for comedy, because Tita he can't do it. That he basically fumbles the ball with it. So I think it's that. So again, that brings it back to the fact that this film has this kind of sense of fun to it. But and on that note, though, what makes the film really interesting is how it's such an upbeat and joyous story, and then it's happening at the time when Italy is being ruled by Mussolini and fascists. So one of the major sequences of the film are when fascists come to the town. It's a great fanfare. So everybody's cheering for them. Almost the entire town is shown celebrating their arrival and participating. So even more than that, it's not even strictly condemning the fascists in a way that you would expect, because the whole town seems to be on their side and happy that they're there. So the only one who really isn't happy that the fascists are there is Tita's father. So he he's prevented from going to anything because they're worried that he's going to cause a problem. But he ultimately, though, he ends up being interrogated by them at a little later, which is actually probably one of the most serious scenes in the film. And the thing is, it makes you wonder what Fellini's relationship to fascism was, because again, he doesn't really vilify them, but I mean, he doesn't treat them well, but he doesn't treat them, he doesn't make them look like monsters though either. So, he treats the scenes with the fascists pretty much as lightheartedly almost as everything else. And maybe he did that in a satirical way. I'm not sure. Some people want to claim that that's what he was doing, but I think other people might, and maybe there are moments where he kind of leans into that a little bit more. But I think that he just showed more a factual, this is how the townspeople were. Because again, there are comedic moments in those scenes. For instance, there's in one of the scenes, Tita's classmates that I was telling you about, he's fantasizing about marrying a girl that he likes in school with them, and the person who's conducting the ceremony is a huge head of Mussolini, basically talking. But I've always interpreted the way Fellini treats fascism in this film is just that it was part of life back then, and that because it was a small town, it just didn't have that much interaction with it. By the time Fellini became a filmmaker, Mussolini and the fascists were out of power. So, maybe he didn't have this axe to grind politically there. And he it's one of the few Italian films I've seen that features fascism in a more kind of benign, lighthearted, almost kind of a caricaturist way. So, he portrays the fascists as immature and silly, which also ties back into the themes of youth, almost as if these men are just grown children playing dress up. And the only real, kind of serious scenes is when there's a scene where there's a phonograph in the square playing a tune that ends up being it's a communist song, and it's meant to be kind of presented as a form of protest against the fascists. So they start to shoot at the phonograph, which you could argue is still kind of in a way comedic, but because they're shooting at an object. But it's meant to show that, okay, these guys are just, they are violent guys. But that also leads into the interrogation of Tita's father, because they think Aurelio was the one who set up the phonograph, which we don't see who sets it up because it just cuts right to the phonograph playing. But there's so many different kinds of scenes in the film, and that's because Fellini decided to create a unique structure for the film. Now, as I said before, the film doesn't have a linear narrative. Instead, it opts to show, different episodes of life throughout the course of the film, and it which takes place over the course of a year. And Fellini did this multiple times, in where his films would have an episodic structure. The first one being La Dolce Vita, but during his later period, it became a lot more common with films like Roma and AMARCORD, Casanova, and then his final film called The Voice of the Moon. But because the film takes place over the yearly passage of time serves as kind of the overall framework as the film, as we see how life in the town changes as the seasons pretty much change. Instead of the film seeming like, it's just kind of random episodes, it feels more like there is this progression. So, granted, there's no clear beginning, middle, and end in regards to, as again like a narrative would have, but it just shows life continuing to move forward, with good things happening and then bad things happening. And I think by giving AMARCORD the structure, it also adds to the dreamlike quality of the film. Because, when we dream, there's no complete narrative. It's just fragmented and excerpted scenes essentially strung together in our subconscious. So, and I think the format of having the film play out as a series of standalone vignettes works better for AMARCORD, because that's just how life is. So life rarely follows a script in our, from day to day. It's just random things happening, and then and us reacting to it. So, and I think as a result of that, you have the more comedic scenes that are intercut with the dramatic scenes, or for instance, we have more comedic scenes in the beginning, and then we have more dramatic scenes in the end. Now, and granted, while the episodes might be able to stand on their own, there are a few ways that Fellini connects them together as a whole. So that is, and again, that is the structure of using the year time frame. So as we see the seasons and we see these scenes represent the town at different points in the year. So when the film starts and ends with the puffballs, which basically serve as when winter is ending and spring is coming, and that's the bookends of the film. And I think by doing this, Fellini's able to show the full context of the town, highlighting specific events. So the burning of the bonfire in the beginning is considered the burning of the winter witch, which is to signify the end of winter and the beginning of spring. So almost like a bizarre alternative to Groundhog Day in the U.S. So, the life at the Grand Hotel is during the summer, because it's a seasonal hotel, as well as the outing with Uncle Tio that also happens in the summertime, and then the viewing of the SS Rex that happens in the fall, along with the scenes with the fog, I think that, that's in the fall. I think the race car sequence is in the fall. And then obviously winter is the easiest one because that's signified by snow. And then again, the narrator, as I mentioned him earlier, he also ties everything in the film together. Being able to have those small connections to each other, it does give the film a little more, again, a little more, it's not just completely random. It does follow some sort of I'll say a trajectory. But I also think, not just dreams, but I also think the fragmented structure is also indicative of how our memories work, especially as we get older. Because as we get older, we might remember specific moments and events very clearly, but the day-to-day minutia from our past just become, harder to remember. So in that sense, AMARCORD serves as a greatest hits for Tita's life in that year. And, depending on what part of Tita's life we're observing, the film adjusts its tone. So, for the episodes that are focused on Tita's family, they tend to be more grounded. So the dinner scene, which is probably the most realistic one in the whole film, that's not played in any kind, it doesn't have any kind of strong visual elements to it that that features in a lot of the other, that in a lot of the other parts of the film. The summer outing with Uncle Tio, which, it does have comedy to it, but there is this undercurrent of sadness. So, that's also another serious film, and then a serious portion of the film. And then the most serious episode is when Tita's mother gets sick, and then ultimately she dies, and there's a funeral for her. So the family scenes actually go progressively from being light to more serious, and then to actually pretty heavy by the end. But then the episodes involving his friends are definitely, they're more heightened and fantastical. So their night on the town, the fascist youth demonstration, the race scene, they're all meant to be like these kind of fun, just bigger scenes in a lot of ways. But the whole tapestry of the film, though, is indicative of, one man's singular, vibrant vision. As I said earlier, AMARCORD was a film that was made in the late stage of Federico Fellini's career. So Fellini emerged as a filmmaker at a time when neorealism became the kind of dominant and popular form in Italian cinema. But he rejected Italian neorealism as a movement because, he didn't want to be stooped in the political undertones of that. So he was more interested in using art as a means of promoting beauty and entertainment instead of a political agenda. So he wanted to just be more imaginative, and he wanted his films to be he wanted them to be a lot more. I'm trying to think of the word. I don't want to keep saying certain words over and over again and get repetitive, but they were just a lot more alive and colorful. So, and I think that's because Fellini was an optimistic filmmaker, which makes his films stand out, especially in this, in a post-war, post-fascist Italy, compared to some of his contemporaries like Roberto Rossellini or Vittorio De Sica. So, and as he transitioned to color films, I believe his stories became even more just amazing as a result. So films like Juliet of the Spirits, Satyricon, and Roma, which I mentioned earlier, all had these incredibly, colorful palettes and kaleidoscopic aesthetics. So, his later films make you wonder, how he actually ever worked in black and white. So I mentioned earlier how he didn't want to shoot the film in his actual hometown of Rimini. And I wanted to expand on that a little bit more here, which was, because he wanted to make the film deliberately a fantasy. So, and he thought that if he shot that in the film in Rimini, it would just become too realistic, and that the sentimentality of his past would influence the film, and so he didn't want that. So he shot the film in a different location as well as in a studio. And I think the big advantage of shooting in a studio is because for the case of this is that the studio gives the film a much more fabricated look, which again I think heightens the unrealistic nature of the story. And Fellini even said that he didn't want to tell a true story; he wanted to tell a fanciful story, which he does. So, and then the scene, the SS Rex scene in the water, that was shot in a water tank at a studio with this giant, basically giant, almost cardboard cutout, or not cardboard, but like this giant cutout of the ship. And it's funny because Fellini even said at points that he thought the ship looked too realistic, and that it needed to look more unrealistic, which I thought was funny. So, in which by contrast, neorealist films, they were predominantly shot in location. They were black and white, and I think that was meant to represent the grounded nature of the stories. So, but Fellini was always a very playful director. And in a film like AMARCORD, he lets that show in practically every scene. I feel like it's almost like he never fully grew up from being a kid in a way. So at least he had that young at heart mentality. So because he expresses that childlike sensibility in multiple ways throughout the film. So again, during the bonfire scene, I mentioned the prank earlier, but then there's also moments where a lot of the kids are like throwing these poppers on the ground, and they're startling the adults. And there's dancing going on, and there's moments where the townspeople get into a circle and they're circling the bonfire. And then during the school montage, where we see the students messing around, where like during the school photo, there's one of the guys ends up freaking out one of the girls with a frog, and then also with, again, where I mentioned earlier about the pranks that they were doing with the one of the characters who ends up. He ends up, I'll say he pees in the middle of class, and then also with the kid during the Greek lesson. And then there's the character of Lalo, he's the wayward uncle, the one who's supposed to be the immature, living off of the service of others, and getting to do whatever he wants. So, so there's all this fun, all this childlike fun that Fellini really channels in the film. But, I think, Fellini also loves to, he has these pure fantasy sequences to further kind of push the boundaries of realism, to turn it into this kind of, to turn it into this like wondrous fairy tale type of story. So there's a scene where it's the supposed story of how Gradiska got her name, and it takes place at the Grand Hotel. And so it starts with her going into the lobby, which the lobby is this amazing set, with this enormous staircase. And then she goes into the room, and the room, again, it's not like it doesn't look like a real hotel room, but the other characters in there are just kind of, they're moving around, and they're kind of dancing, or maybe not really dancing, but just moving in this kind of flamboyant way that's not natural. And then she's, there's this, she's kind of posing and acting like this kind of young ingenue, coquettish in a way, where she's trying to be playful and sexual but innocent at the same time. And then again, there's the fantasy. I told you there's the fantasy sequence where one of his friends thinks, pretends he, is trying to get married. There's the sequence in the fog where, which is incredibly reminiscent of fairy tales. So most notably like the Headless Horseman or Little Red Riding Hood. Because for, where one of the boys is walking through the scene with basically like a hood on, and you've got these kind of dead trees around him. Or dead looking trees around him. So, and, lights in the fog, which look somewhat ominous. And then during the race scene, we see Tita imagining himself being a champion race driver who invites Gradiska to come with him as like the ultimate trophy and prize. And I think that these fantasy sequences just reinforce the notion that Fellini is just still this youthful dreamer on the inside. So, and the look of the film is highly stylized, which gives its vivid and phantasmagoric look. So, the puffballs floating around, the SS Rex, the entire, the fog sequence, and the thing is I think, that Fellini he has a deep love for these characters. And I think it's just stemming from the fact that so many of them were based on again, real people that he grew up with. And because all the characters, they have something likable about them. So he doesn't want you to dislike these people in any way. Even the fascists, in a way. I mean, the fascists are probably the most unlikable, but they're still not unlikable to the point where, you actively dislike them. They're just more kind of buffoonish. So, but like Tita's father, he might come off like a tyrant because he's yelling and he's constantly on Tita, but there's more layers to the character than that. And while some people think that his focus on female body parts means that is something that's all he cares about, but I choose to interpret that as he appreciates just the beauty of women. So, because again, he treats the female characters, Gradiska is not this throwaway character. She's a wonderful character. So, and they're not caricatures, they're not stereotypes, even though some people might see them that way. I think that they're more complex than they initially seem, just trying to grapple with control over their own lives. So Gradiska is initially seen as this fantasy, but her fantasy is to live happily ever after with the man of her dreams, which they keep saying in the movie is, you're Gary Cooper. So she worries that she might be too old to get married, which causes her a lot of sadness in it. And then, Tita's mother, she might seem like she's constantly fed up with Aurelio and that they have this acrimonious relationship. But when he gets back from being interrogated, she's the one who is taking care of him after that. She's the one who's cleaning him up in the bathtub, and she's the one who is there for him in this kind of really tender and loving way. So, and I think it's a shame that after AMARCORD, Fellini actually had a tough time trying to make films. Audiences' tastes had changed by this point. The Italian film industry didn't see as much value in Fellini anymore. And it made it harder for him to get financing or have full artistic control. Which again, I think is really sad. So ultimately Fellini, I think Fellini wanted AMARCORD to be just a celebration of life in the world that he grew up in. So I say that Fellini is probably my favorite Italian filmmaker. There's so many great ones out there, but I find that Fellini's works to just be the most pleasing to watch. And while his contemporaries like Rossellini and De Sica were making these more serious, reality-heavy films, Fellini just always leaned into the lighter side of life, which I appreciated. So, and I understand after World War II, the country had to go through a detox period, as it were, and Italian neorealism was a form of therapy for the country. But whereas the films of neorealism sought to directly deal with the lingering effects of fascism on the country, Fellini just sought to look at the wonder that is life, which I also think is important, because life can be extraordinary. And I think it's important for filmmakers to reflect that as well. Films don't always have to be these serious tomes of depression or angst or oppression or all this stuff. Like we can make, they can make films that are about just loving life. And and Fellini I think he was a lover of life. And AMARCORD is a celebration and testament to loving that small town life. Because often in films about small towns, the protagonist is usually they just want to get out. They're just itching to leave for a better life, to see a bigger world. So that's for, you have Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life. You have Rob Reiner's Stand By Me. Even George Lucas's original Star Wars with Luke. He wanted to get out of that farm and see the rest of the galaxy. But AMARCORD is one of those films that I discovered, just has a wide variety of interpretations. Again, because life isn't simple, So we watch the film, and we don't necessarily think that, for instance, Tita hates his family, likes his family. Like, it's just we decide based on what we see. So, and while I was researching this episode, I came across different perspectives. And I think some of them were completely opposite of mine, but I think that again, great art doesn't have just one interpretation to it. So it can mean one thing to me, and then another thing incredibly different to another person. So they might see the film as a satire of small town life, and an indictment of certain lifestyles or people or political ideologies. Whereas, I tend to see, I saw the film as just him presenting this town and these people, and him doing it in this kind of fun and loving way. And what I find really interesting about the film is that it's autobiographical, but it's also a complete invention as well. Fellini used real life to set the foundation of the work, but then he created this incredible fantasy around it. So and I think AMARCORD is definitely one of his most fun and enjoyable films. And because the film is episodic in nature, it's able to explore so many different facets of life in a small town, which allows us to see the characters in many different ways and situations and experiences. The characters are so vibrant and alive that it just makes the film so easy to watch over and over again. And since the film has has no real structure, because it's all vignettes, the characters, you have to like them, I feel like, because you don't want to spend 2 hours with people that you don't like. So, and I said earlier that the main character wasn't based on Fellini, and I found it interesting that Tita just wasn't based on him, that it was based on one of his friends, because I think it's easy to make the main character based on yourself. But he did that, and it's weird. It almost shows his humility as a filmmaker and a storyteller, because he doesn't set himself as the main character. He's almost an impartial observer, as it were. So, and if I were to recommend Fellini to someone who's never seen one of his movies, AMARCORD would definitely be one of my first choices. So, that I would tell people. So, and my favorite parts of the film are where Fellini does lean into the fantasy aspects of it. So the scenes at the Grand Hotel and the SS Rex and the race. But I also think that the film is just extraordinarily beautiful to look at. It's incredibly lush visually, and just you could pick so many images from the film, and they would look like paintings. So that's something that I really appreciate films from that time, because I just love films that have very strong color palettes to them. I know some people don't like that, but that's something that I really like. So now, regarding how you can watch the film, it is currently available on Criterion's website, where you can get the DVD like I have here, or the Blu-ray. So you can get that on Criterion's website, or you can go watch it on the Criterion channel as well. So another easy one to track down. But I just want to say thank you for joining me on this episode of the Criterion Chronicle. I hope you enjoyed it. And I would like you to stay tuned to see what's coming up next on the show. Up next on the Criterion Chronicle, we will be exploring the debut feature of one of the French New Wave's most prolific directors, Francois Truffaut, Criterion Spine number 5, The 400 Blows. So, if you would like to continue on this journey with me through the Criterion Collection, then make sure that you subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you never miss an episode. I will say that please take care, and I hope to see you next time.